Now, Kenya's tourism sector has lost about 80 billion shillings since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. The sector has lost a lot of revenue due to grounding of the aviation sector, which is the largest contributor to tourism and overall travel restrictions. Restrictions put in place to manage the spread of the coronavirus have also affected the industry, resulting in massive pay cuts, job losses and unpaid leaves. But is it really all doomed for this sector? On the front row, on this episode of the Front Row, we have a distinguished panel that will help us get a look at the state of the tourism sector in the country, even as the ministry released a report on the same yesterday. More importantly, what is the way forward? There are guidelines that have been issued for the reopening of hotels. To what extent will they help put the sector back on its feet? Thank you for joining us on this very crucial conversation. I am Akisa Wandera, and to be part of this edition of the Front Row, send your questions by logging into slido.com. Enter event code as #TheFrontRow. We're also available on Twitter at KTN News KE at Akisa Wandera. You can as well use the #TheFrontRow. Here now are our panelists. Let's take a look at who will be part of this conversation tonight. We begin with Honorable Safina Kwekwe-Tsungu, who was appointed the Principal Secretary for Tourism in the Ministry of Tourism and Wildlife on the 14th of January this year. She has served in various organizations and institutions, both in civil society and the public sector. Notably, she served as the Principal Secretary for Gender in the Ministry of Public Service, Youth and Gender from March 2018 to January 2020. She worked as a County Executive Committee member for Trade and Cooperative Development in Kwale County for more than 8 years, and she worked with Action Aid International Kenya as a women's rights coordinator. Now, Honorable Tsungu also served the East African community as a legislator in the Second East African Legislative Assembly. There, she pioneered the establishment of the Iala Women's Parliamentarians Forum, which she chaired for 5 years. Thank you for joining us tonight, Honorable Safina Kwekwe-Tsungu. Glad to have you here with us. Now, we also have Mr. David Gashuru, who's the General Manager at Sarova Pan-Afric. He has expansive experience as a General Manager of the high-rated hotels, including Diani Sea Resort, Jardini Beach, and Africana Sea Lodge, and Sarova White Sands, Sarova Stanley, and Sarova Pan-Afric. As an industry player, it will be interesting to hear what he has to say about what the industry currently looks like, what the way forward is, and of course, how sustainable and viable are the guidelines that have been put in place. Third, we have Mohamed Hersi, who is the chairman of the Kenya Tourism Federation. He's a tourism expert and a respectable voice in the tourism and hospitality sector in the country with a vast experience in hospitality management. Mr. Hersi is a certified governance trainer and a past president of the Rotary Club of Mombasa. He's passionate about matters Africa and joining us on this panel with his vast experience in this sector, looking at all the other players in this industry. He will be speaking especially on the private sector and how they are currently coping with the pandemic. Finally, on our panel tonight, we have Mike Macharia, the CEO of the Kenya Association of Hotel Keepers and Caterers. He has over 30 years experience in the hospitality and tourism sector, including assignments at Hilton International and Sarova Hotels. Currently, he also serves in the board of FKE, KEPSA, the Kenya Tourism Federation, PERAC, the National Tourism Crisis Response Team, and Boma Hospitality College. He previously worked as the General Manager of Windsor Golf Hotel and Country Club. Mr. Macharia also served on the following boards representing the industry, one of them being the Kenya Tourism Board and the Tourism Regulatory Authority, as well as Kenya Utalii College, the Nairobi Water Company, and Athi Water Services Board, amongst others. Once again, another panelist with an expansive bio there, or a profile that will really help us understand matters tourism, and especially also looking at the region and how we can take advantage of opportunities that have presented themselves to ensure we have a wider net for our revenue streams in the sector. And before we get to that, of course, thanking all our panelists for joining us tonight here on the front row, let's take a look at a story that will set the stage for us. The local tourism sector will have to rely on domestic tourism to kickstart its recovery. The global travel expected to remain subdued until next year. Now, according to Tourism Cabinet Secretary Najib Balala, players will have to be innovative and diversify their product offering to attract both local and international tourists. Let's now have a look at this story that will kickstart our conversation at the moment.
The coronavirus pandemic has triggered an unprecedented crisis in the tourism sector, with the imposition of lockdowns, travel restriction curfews, and the closure of hospitality facilities to curb the spread of the virus. As a result, more than 90% of hotels remain closed, with direct and indirect jobs hanging in the balance. Efforts to save the sector are set to get into high gear following the launch of the National Tourism Crisis Steering Committee long-awaited report outlining a recovery framework for the sector.
There will be a new normal.
Hello?
And if anybody thinks that life will be as it was in the tourism industry, unfortunately.
According to the CS, for these plans to succeed, health and safety should be prioritized as every single person will be more conscious of it. Players in the sector now need to invest in training their staff and ensuring their premises meet the highest standard of health safety.
Every county, every property, every facility must put health and safety of their clients first. Then people will be assured.
The sector has also been encouraged to move away from over-reliance on traditional attractions like beaches and safari and diversify to new attractions that will set them aside from their competitors from around the region.
We cannot be singing out of Africa, still that glory of out of Africa. Yes, it boosted Kenya 35 years ago, but we need to come with a new out of Africa. That is what we want to do. We can't be doing the same thing we used to do them before. We need to do different things this time.
Balala also called on local players to review their packages to attract domestic tourists because the current packages are too expensive and unattractive to ordinary Kenyans.
You want to charge $300 to go to Masai Mara? Domestic tourism will not pay $300 to go to Masai Mara. Domestic tourism will get $300 to go to Dubai. But if the pricing is going to be high, you will not get even domestic tourism. I can tell you that.
Sector players with all facilities have also been encouraged to reinvest into their facilities to ensure they can compete favorably with their peers. In this year's budget, the government set aside 3 billion shillings under the Tourism Fund to help the sector bounce back from the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. Philip Keitany, KTN News.
Philip Keitany there with a story on that report launched yesterday by the Cabinet Secretary Najib Balala. And of course, we'll be really discussing some of the details of this particular report with my panelists tonight. And perhaps we could start with the PS Tourism joining us tonight. From what we've had the CS say there about the report when launching it yesterday, just talk to us about, maybe let's begin with the highlights of the report and perhaps what it means. The CS there hinting that we might reopen in July. Speak to us about that report and whether this is possible.
Thank you. And yes, indeed, the tourism industry has gone through tremendous losses. And the report that was launched yesterday, which was on the impact of tourism, of COVID on tourism, the measures taken and the recovery pathways, has ably highlighted where we've been. At high of 2 million arrivals, international arrivals, 4.8 million domestic tourists, to a low of 0 in April. And this has been, a situation which us as Kenya and the world in totality have to deal with, not just in the short term, but probably even in the long term, 2 to 3 years and beyond. So what we've seen now is that we've had 81% of workers within the industry have been laid off. They started with leave, unpaid leave, and then now, because of the situation being sustaining itself for more than the 3 months that we had anticipated, we have quite a considerable number of people who are now at home jobless. But of course, also the tourism industry has tried to mitigate the human resource losses by assuring those that have had to go home that the moment we bounce back, these are the people who will be considered as a first priority because they have the experience and they're already skilled. 80 billion is the losses that our industry has suffered, the tourism industry. And when you look at this 80%, it has been occasioned by cancellations. 81% of international tourists have cancelled their bookings. And we have 64% who have also cancelled domestically their bookings. So we really are seeing that from these cancellations, 80% of business, 80 billion worth of business has been lost. And it is indeed a challenge, not just to the tourism industry, the mainstream industry, but also to the other industries that depend on the tourism industry for their survival.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's bring in Mr. Hersi. I'll be coming back to you shortly to just speak to us about, because that report really talks about a recovery pathway for the sector. So we'll have you speak expansively on that. Mr. Hersi from the Kenya Federation of from the Kenya Tourism Federation, I beg your pardon for that, coming from the private sector. And of course, there have been a lot of consultation with the government. Speak to us about, one, this report and a number of guidelines that are in this particular report. How is the private sector taking it? Is it possible?
Good evening, everyone. And the most critical thing is that we work very closely with government. And we would like to thank His Excellency the President and also our CS and the PS for being in the forefront when it comes to matters tourism from day one when we started having the COVID crisis. These guidelines that will be issued tomorrow, for instance, is something that we work together with government. And it's going to be ratified tomorrow so that we are able to start engaging the recovery gears. Now, there are a lot of details that are involved in the report. For instance, we are talking about where we've come from. 2019 was a very good year. And we were looking forward to a great 2020, which unfortunately is not going to happen. But having said that, again, the strategy that we've laid out, it's something we've worked with government closely, both from all the sectors in the industry. That is the aviation, the airlines, the airport itself, where people are going to land, and then tour operators, the hotels, the restaurants, the travel agents, everyone who is involved in the in the chain. So. In the past, it was the challenges we faced used to be only about security, and that was purely just Kenya, and then our bounce back was very easy. But this time around, it's the whole world. The whole world is not traveling. And this is just not touching on security, but this is on safety, on something that you can't even see. So safety is a very personal thing when it comes to hygiene factors. So that's going to be a challenge, but we are prepared for it. And we are going to engage the recovery process, or rather the programs that we've laid out in conjunction with Kenya Tourism Board.
So, and I'm glad you mentioned that 2019 was a very good year. So these challenges that we're seeing in 2020 means we'll do very little. So what can we do differently, especially for this year between now and December? Is it all gloom and doom between now and December until next year, maybe?
You see, for me, I don't look at things for doom and gloom. I am always an optimist, but a realist at the same time. Now, we're just halfway in the year, which means we have got 6 more months. Now, I'll be lying to you if I told you that international market will bounce back easily. That's going to be a tall order. It's going to be very challenging. You can clearly see already EU saying that, Kenya and many other countries may not be eligible to enter, EU. But hopefully that will change in the coming weeks. But 2020, what is remaining out of it, we've identified what is close to us. And that's what even UNWTO has clearly has made it clear, that the first areas that are going to recover is domestic tourism. Because even in Europe, many countries are encouraging their nationals to travel within their own country. And if they have to go out, you just go out maybe one border, which means that your immediate neighbor. So the same is going to apply to Kenya, the same is going to apply to Africa, the same is going to apply to Africa. So for the first time, we need now to start looking inside out rather than looking outside in. And international business may start coming back maybe from November moving forward. And we can't wait until November to start putting our ass together. So we need to embrace domestic tourism. And the good thing is that as Kenyans and as hospitality players, be it tour operators, be it hotels, we embraced domestic tourism 10 years ago during the infamous post-election violence in our recovery strategy. And 2018, the statistics we got was that 56% of hotel beds in Kenya were actually occupied by domestic tourists. And even South Africa is trying to learn from Kenya. Next door, Tanzania, Uganda don't even have any domestic tourism, to talk about. So Kenya, we've embraced domestic tourism, and that's what's going to be our first bounce back. And then we also look at our landlocked countries, our neighbors, which is Ethiopia, a population of 100 million. Take, for instance, even if 2 million, 3 million are going to visit, those are very good numbers. Then Uganda, another landlocked country, and they have revived their airline. They were flying to Mombasa until COVID came knocking. So it means that we'll be looking at all our neighbors. And then Rwanda next door as well, which is another landlocked country. And we go all the way further up, places like Djibouti, where we have the French naval base, we've got the US naval base. So all these guys will be looking at places that is close by. And Kenya, we are well positioned to receive them.
Well, thank you for that. Domestic tourism, I'm glad you mentioned that, because we're going to expansively talk about that and what it means. It is heavily featured in that particular report that was launched yesterday by the CS. But you, Mark Macharia, coming from the Association of Hotel Keepers and Caterers, and also a member of that steering committee that perhaps came up with this report, from the guidelines that have been set and the protocols that perhaps are going to be set tomorrow, from your thinking, even as you give us your opening remarks, how long will it take for hotels to now say that they're ready to open up to visitors and guests?
Thank you, Akisa. Good evening, everyone. We, as a hotel sector, we have always been ready. If you look at what we've been doing, including our training, we are trained to be very high, to maintain very high standards of hygiene. So for us, cleaning surfaces, disinfecting areas, having protocols is a normal thing. And that's why you saw when we had these passengers come in, we had about 2,000 passengers coming back home during the advent of the crisis. And we were able to keep them safe. We were able to keep them for periods of over 8 weeks. And there was no cross-infection between the passengers and our staff. So we've always been ready. The industry protocols is just an addition. It's just now to bring the health issue into play. But for us, if we are told, get your hotels open tomorrow, We've already done everything. We've tested our staff. We've put in sanitizers. We have the thermal guns. We have the cleaning agents. So we are completely ready to open. So in that respect, it's easy for us to pick up and just move on. The only thing is that we need to find a way of letting the customer base know that we are open and when we are going to open. We hope that this time His Excellency the President will announce some form of reopening and we can start receiving clients. Because we've been very, very hard hit. As you know, our area is very labor intensive. From all the money that is made in the hotel industry, we spend about 35% in salaries. So if the loss is at 80 billion at the moment, you can see how much we are talking about, almost 24 billion shillings in unpaid salaries. And that also has an effect on the economy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, and shortly we'll be looking at statistics around that, and especially from that report. Let's hear from our final guest, David Gashuru, an industry player, General Manager, Sarova Pan-Afric. This is one of the hotels that have come up with ways to try and just make some revenue or some money during this pandemic. Sarova Pan-Afric repurposed about 80 rooms into office spaces. How has that worked for you so far?
Good evening. Thank you, Akisa. First, let me say, in the last 3 months, we've been hit heavily. From the time the close down started, we have incurred costs on a daily basis. The hotels incur costs daily, even when they are closed. It doesn't matter whether it's operating or not. Security has to be maintained. Cleanliness has to be maintained. Lights have to be put on because of security reasons and other costs that are hidden. So we incur costs on a daily, almost every other second, we are incurring costs. So when there is no business, we keep on accumulating costs on the other side. Now, to keep going, we will need some guests to come back. This industry is a multi-stakeholder industry. We have the guests, we have our staff, we have the investors who have invested in this one, and of course we have the community around us who, in a big way, depend on us. And we also depend on them. When you have no guests, the staff have to stay at home. A few have to be here. We incur the costs. So again, salaries have to be paid, and a point has reached where it is impossible, because when you have nothing coming in, then obviously how are you going to pay? So if the situation continues in the next month, a lot of drastic measures may need to be taken, actually have to be taken, to at least keep the business going, incurring those costs, which will later have to be recovered somehow. And some of these measures, we look at what is making it impossible to keep the doors open, and that is the cost that is always there. Very unfortunate that it will have to hit the people first. Also, the deterioration of the properties, the facilities, such that when the guests come back, the standards will no longer be the same like what we knew before. So we need to have these guests come back, even locally, to keep the facilities up. I think looking at the measures that have been taken, we are lucky that this is an industry that has always had standards. We kept the hotels clean. Yes, social distance was never kept because it was not a reality that time. Now it is. The numbers that we can accommodate have shrunk to below 50%, sometimes below 40%. Because space which was meant for 50 people can now take comfortably 20 people. If it was for 100, we are talking of 40 people. And we don't want to, it's not a question of breaking the law, it's a question of looking at a balancing act between life, saving lives, and the economic impact on our hotels. So with numbers going down, with nothing coming in, then you have a challenge.
All right, great. Getting back to you shortly.
Yes.
I'm sorry to cut you short, Mr. Gishuru. When we get back, I'm coming back to you shortly to finish your point. And of course, other questions around those guidelines and how industry players generally feel about that. I want us to quickly take a short break. You're watching the Front Row. Remember, you can be part of this conversation. It's your show too. Let's hear from you. What questions do you have to the PS, to Mohammed Hersi, Mike Washira from the Kenya Association of Hotel Keepers and Caterers, as well as David Gishuru? I'll be posing these questions to them when we get back from the break. So keep tweeting and texting us. 22155, slido.com. The hashtag to use is the Front Row. And on Twitter at Akisa Wandera at KTN News. We'll be engaging and I'll be taking a look at some of your feedback when we get back. Stay with us.